Sarah Martinez had always known that intelligence work meant taking risks, but she never imagined she would find herself crouched behind a crumbling stone wall in the mountains of Afghanistan, completely alone and defenseless. The 28-year-old CIA analyst had been sent on what was supposed to be a routine mission to gather information about Taliban movements in the region. Now, 3 days after her team had abandoned her, she was fighting for survival in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The mission had started like any other. Sarah's team of 6 operatives had been inserted into the remote valley under cover of darkness. Their objective was simple: locate and photograph a suspected weapons cache that satellite imagery had identified in a small village. Sarah's job was to analyze any documents they might find and provide real-time intelligence support to the team leader, Commander Jake Morrison. 6 months after her rescue, Sarah Martinez stood at the podium of the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, facing an audience of intelligence officers, military personnel, and government officials. The Distinguished Intelligence Cross glinted on her chest, awarded for her extraordinary heroism under the most extreme circumstances. But the recognition felt hollow compared to the empty chairs that should have been occupied by her fallen teammates. The debriefing sessions had taken weeks to complete. Sarah's intelligence about Taliban operations, gathered during her 3 days of observation before the attack, had proven invaluable. Her detailed reports on enemy communications, tactics, and equipment had already been used to plan successful operations against the same group that had killed her team. But the official recognition was not what drove Sarah anymore. In the months following her return, she had struggled with survivor's guilt, nightmares, and the constant question of why she had lived while better trained, more experienced operatives had died. The answer had come to her gradually, through countless hours of therapy and soul-searching. She was alive for a reason. The speech she was about to give had been months in preparation. It was not the sanitized, politically correct address that her superiors had originally requested. Instead, it was a raw, honest account of what she had learned about survival, about leadership, and about the true cost of intelligence work. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "6 months ago, I was abandoned behind enemy lines in Afghanistan. Not by choice, not by design, but by the brutal mathematics of warfare. My team died protecting the mission, and I survived because I was in the right place at the right time." The audience shifted uncomfortably. They had expected a triumphant tale of American heroism, not this unflinching examination of military reality. But what I want to talk about today is not my survival. It's what I learned during those 6 days about the people we're fighting, about ourselves, and about what it truly means to serve your country. Sarah had spent considerable time researching the Taliban fighters who had attacked her team. Through captured communications and prisoner interrogations, she had learned that the assault had been planned for weeks. The enemy had known exactly where to find them, exactly when to strike. There had been a leak somewhere in the intelligence chain, though investigations had never identified the source. Sarah suspected they never would. In the murky world of Afghan tribal politics and shifting loyalties, betrayal was as common as breathing. But what had surprised her most was learning about the Taliban commander who had led the attack. Khalil Ahmad was a former Afghan National Army officer who had defected after American forces had accidentally killed his family in an airstrike. He was not a fanatic or a terrorist in the traditional sense, but a man driven by personal loss to wage war against those he blamed for his tragedy. "The enemy is not a cartoon villain," Sarah continued. "They are human beings with their own motivations, their own losses, their own reasons for fighting. This does not make them right, but it makes them dangerous in ways we often fail to understand." During her therapy sessions, Sarah had been forced to confront the moral complexity of her work. Intelligence gathering was not clean or simple. Every piece of information came at a human cost. Every successful mission created new enemies. Every victory generated fresh cycles of violence. But she had also learned about the American forces who had searched for her. Lieutenant Commander Peterson's SEAL team had volunteered for the rescue mission, even though official policy was to consider her lost. They had spent 3 days combing the mountains, risking their lives for someone they had never met. Peterson had visited her several times during her recovery. Their conversations had been awkward at first, both of them struggling with the intensity of their shared experience. But, gradually, a friendship had developed based on mutual respect and understanding. "The man who saved my life has been deployed 6 times to Afghanistan," Sarah said, looking directly at Peterson, who was sitting in the front row. "He has seen friends die, missions fail, and victories turn to ashes. Yet he continues to serve, continues to risk his life for strangers, because he believes in something larger than himself." The official investigation into the failed mission had been thorough but ultimately unsatisfying. Blame had been distributed among various levels of command, procedures had been revised, and new protocols had been implemented. But the fundamental reality remained unchanged. Intelligence work in Afghanistan was inherently dangerous, and people would continue to die. Sarah's new assignment was to help design better survival training for intelligence officers operating in hostile territory. She had spent months developing new protocols, drawing on her experience to create more realistic scenarios and more practical skills training. The work was satisfying in ways she had not expected. Each technique she taught, each procedure she refined, might save lives in the future. It was a way of honoring her fallen teammates while ensuring that their deaths had meaning. "Survival is not about being the strongest or the smartest," Sarah explained to her audience. "It's about being able to adapt, to think clearly under pressure, and to never give up hope. Most importantly, it's about remembering that you are not alone. Somewhere, someone is looking for you." Dr. Santos, the military physician who had treated Sarah at the forward operating base, had become an unlikely mentor. Their conversations about trauma and recovery had helped Sarah understand that survival was not just about the immediate crisis, but about learning to live with the aftermath. The nightmares had gradually faded, but they had been replaced by something else, a profound appreciation for ordinary moments of safety and peace. A hot shower, a comfortable bed, a simple conversation with a friend. These everyday experiences now carried emotional weight that most people could never understand. Sarah had also reconnected with the families of her fallen teammates. The meetings had been painful, but necessary. She owed them the truth about their loved ones' final moments, about how they had died fighting to complete the mission and protect each other. Commander Morrison's widow, Jennifer, had become particularly close to Sarah. Their friendship was built on shared loss and mutual understanding of the sacrifices required by military service. Jennifer's strength in raising 2 young children alone had inspired Sarah's own journey toward healing. "The greatest lesson I learned," Sarah said, nearing the end of her speech, "is that courage is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to continue fighting despite that fear. My teammates showed that courage when they chose to stand and fight against impossible odds. The SEAL team that rescued me showed it when they flew into enemy fire to bring one person home. And all of you show it every day when you choose to serve in difficult and dangerous circumstances." As Sarah concluded her remarks, the audience rose and sustained applause. But she was not thinking about the recognition or the medal on her chest. She was thinking about the lessons still to be learned, the lives still to be saved, and the work still to be done. After the ceremony, Peterson approached her as the crowd dispersed. "Good speech," he said simply. "How are you holding up?" "Better," Sarah replied honestly. "Some days are harder than others, but I'm learning to live with it." "The guilt gets easier," Peterson said quietly. "Not because you forget, but because you find ways to honor the people you lost." As they walked out of the auditorium together, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been an analyst who had never fired a weapon in anger or faced life-threatening danger. Now she was a survivor, a teacher, and something she had never expected to become, a warrior in her own right. The war in Afghanistan continued, as did the broader struggle against terrorism and extremism around the world. Intelligence officers would continue to deploy to dangerous places, risking their lives to gather information that might prevent future attacks or save American lives. Some of them would not come home. But because of what Sarah had learned in 6 days of hell in the Afghan mountains, more of them would have the skills and knowledge they needed to survive when everything went wrong. And if they found themselves alone and afraid in hostile territory, they would remember that somewhere, someone was looking for them. That knowledge might make all the difference between life and death. Sarah Martinez had been left behind enemy lines, unarmed and alone. But she had not been forgotten, and she would never let anyone else be forgotten either. That was her mission now, her purpose, and her way of ensuring that the sacrifice of her teammates would never be in vain. The helicopter that found her had brought her home. Now it was her responsibility to make sure others could find their way home too. Everything had gone according to plan for the first 2 days. They had established a hidden observation post on a hillside overlooking the village and had successfully identified the location of the weapons cache. Sarah had intercepted several radio communications that confirmed the site was indeed being used by Taliban forces to store rockets and ammunition. The team was preparing to call in an airstrike when everything went wrong. On the third morning, Sarah had been sent to a secondary observation point about half a mile from the main camp to monitor radio frequencies from a different angle. She had been there for only an hour when she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. Through her binoculars, she watched in horror as 3 Taliban helicopters descended on her team's position. The Black Hawk helicopter descended rapidly towards Sarah's position, its rotors creating a deafening whirlwind of dust and debris. Through the chaos, she could see the distinctive outline of armed soldiers preparing to fast rope down to her location. But the Taliban trucks were closer than ever, their engines roaring as they navigated the treacherous mountain road. Lieutenant Commander Ryan "Shark" Peterson leaned out of the helicopter's open door, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the tactical situation below. As the leader of SEAL Team 6 rescue unit, he had conducted dozens of extractions under fire. But this one was particularly challenging. The enemy vehicles were less than 2 minutes from the landing zone, and his team had no margin for error. "Contact below, 11 o'clock, shouted Petty Officer Marcus Chun, the team's designated marksman. Through his scope, he could see muzzle flashes from the lead Taliban vehicle as fighters began shooting at the approaching helicopter. Sarah pressed herself flat against the rocky ground as bullets whined overhead. The helicopter pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Lisa "Phoenix" Rodriguez, skillfully maneuvered the aircraft to avoid the incoming fire while positioning for a quick extraction. Her years of combat flying experience in Iraq and Afghanistan had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. 30 seconds to touchdown, Rodriguez announced over the intercom. "We're taking small arms fire from multiple positions. This is going to be hot and fast." Peterson and his 3-man team prepared their equipment for immediate deployment. They had been searching for Sarah for 3 days, following up on intercepts of Taliban radio chatter that mentioned capturing an American intelligence officer. The CIA had officially declared her missing in action, but Peterson's unit never abandoned their own. The helicopter touched down on the narrow ridge in a cloud of dust and rotor wash. Peterson was the first out, his M4 carbine at the ready as he sprinted towards Sarah's position. Behind him, Petty Officers Chun, Davis, and Williams spread out to establish a defensive perimeter. "American! American!" Sarah shouted, waving her arms as Peterson approached. She had never been so happy to see another human being in her entire life. "Sarah Martinez?" Peterson yelled over the noise of the helicopter. "Yes. Oh God, yes. We're here to take you home." Peterson grabbed her arm and began pulling her toward the aircraft. "Can you run?" Sarah's legs felt like rubber after 6 days of malnutrition and exhaustion, but adrenaline gave her strength. "I can run." The Taliban vehicles had reached the lower slope of the ridge and were disgorging fighters who began advancing up the hill on foot. Chin's rifle cracked repeatedly as he engaged targets moving between the rocks below. "Contact! Contact!" Multiple hostiles advancing from the south. Williams tossed a smoke grenade to provide concealment as the team began their fighting withdrawal toward the helicopter. The purple smoke billowed across the ridge, providing some visual cover but also alerting every Taliban fighter in the area to their exact location. "Move, move, move," Peterson shouted, keeping one hand on Sarah's shoulder as they ran. The helicopter's door gunner, Petty Officer Jake Morrison, opened fire with his M240 machine gun, the heavy weapon's deep chatter adding to the cacophony of battle. Sarah stumbled, but Peterson caught her, half carrying her the last 20 yards to the aircraft. "I've got you. Don't give up now." Just as they reached the helicopter, A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past the aircraft's tail rotor, exploding against the rocks behind them. The blast knocked Sarah to her knees, but Peterson hauled her upright and literally threw her through the helicopter's open door. RPG, RPG, Rodriguez screamed into her microphone. We need to go now. Chun was the last to board, firing controlled bursts at pursuing Taliban fighters even as the helicopter began to lift off. A second RPG passed directly beneath the aircraft as it gained altitude, the explosion so close that everyone inside felt the shock wave. As they climbed away from the ridge, Sarah found herself crying uncontrollably. The relief was so overwhelming that her body simply could not contain it any longer. Peterson knelt beside her, offering her his water bottle and an energy bar. You're safe now, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for such an imposing figure. We've got you. Sarah tried to speak, but could only nod. The horror of the past 6 days seemed like a nightmare that was finally ending. But Peterson's next words brought her crashing back to reality. We need to know what happened to your team, he said. The CIA has had no contact since your mission went dark. Are there other survivors? Through her tears, Sarah managed to tell him about the attack on her teammates, about Commander Morrison's final radio transmission, about the 3 days she had waited for rescue that never came. Peterson's expression grew grimmer with each detail. We'll go back for them, he promised. No one gets left behind. But even as he said it, Peterson knew the chances of finding survivors after 6 days were virtually zero. The fact that Sarah had made it this long was nothing short of miraculous. Her survival was a testament to her training, her determination, and no small amount of luck. The flight to the forward operating base took 40 minutes, during which the helicopter was escorted by 2 Apache attack helicopters that had been scrambled when the rescue mission encountered resistance. Sarah spent most of the flight staring out the window at the hostile landscape below, still not quite believing she was actually safe. As they approached the base, she could see the sprawling collection of tents, vehicles, and defensive positions that marked the American presence in this remote corner of Afghanistan. It looked like the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. The helicopter touched down on the base's landing pad, where a medical team was waiting with a stretcher. Despite Sarah's protests that she could walk, the medics insisted on checking her immediately for injuries, dehydration, and exhaustion. While the medical team worked, Peterson debriefed with his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Hawk Mitchell. The colonel's weathered face showed the strain of commanding operations in one of the world's most dangerous regions. What's her condition? Mitchell asked. Remarkable, considering what she's been through, Peterson replied. Dehydrated, exhausted, some minor cuts and bruises, but she's coherent and mobile. 6 days alone in Taliban territory without weapons or support. I've never seen anything like it. Mitchell nodded grimly. What about her team? No survivors. She witnessed the entire attack. Taliban hit them with overwhelming force, used helicopters for the assault. Very sophisticated operation. Intelligence value? Significant. She was monitoring their communications for 3 days before the attack. Plus, she's got detailed information about Taliban tactics and capabilities that could be valuable for future operations. In the medical tent, Sarah was slowly beginning to feel human again. The 4 fluids were helping with her dehydration, and the military rations tasted better than any meal she could remember. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of her dead teammates. Dr. Elena Santos, the base's senior medical officer, sat beside her cot. You're going to be fine physically, she said. But I want to talk to you about what you've experienced. Survival situations like this can have psychological effects that don't appear immediately. Sarah nodded, though she was not sure she was ready to process the emotional trauma yet. When can I go home? There's a transport flight leaving for Bugram tomorrow morning. From there, you'll be on a plane back to the States within 24 hours. But even as the doctor spoke, Sarah could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors as another mission launched into the Afghanistan night. The war continued, and somewhere out there, other Americans might be fighting for their lives just as she had been. Peterson appeared at the entrance to the medical tent, his gear cleaned and stowed, but his expression still serious. Mind if I sit with her for a few minutes, Doc? Dr. Santos nodded and stepped outside, leaving Sarah alone with her rescuer. For a moment, Neither of them spoke. "Thank you," Sarah finally whispered. "I thought I was going to die out there." Peterson shook his head. "You saved yourself. We just gave you a ride home. What you did, surviving out there for 6 days, that took courage most people don't have. I was so scared. Every minute of every day. Being scared doesn't make you a coward. Acting despite being scared, that's what makes you a hero." As Sarah drifted off to sleep that night, she held on to those words. Tomorrow she would begin the long journey home, back to a world that suddenly seemed impossibly safe and comfortable. But she would never forget the lesson she had learned in the mountains of Afghanistan, that the human spirit could endure far more than she had ever imagined possible. The firefight was brief, but devastating. Sarah could only watch helplessly as her teammates fought desperately against overwhelming odds. Commander Morrison's voice crackled over her radio one last time. "Eagle 6 to Overwatch. We are compromised and taking heavy casualties. Execute emergency extraction protocol immediately. Do not attempt rescue. Repeat, do not attempt rescue." Then, silence. Sarah waited for 6 agonizing hours, hoping against hope that her team had somehow escaped. But, as darkness fell, and no one came for her, the terrible truth became clear. She was alone in enemy territory with nothing but her radio, a small amount of food and water, and her wits to keep her alive. The first night was the hardest. Sarah had never been in combat before, and the sounds of the Afghan wilderness seemed to contain 1,000 threats. Every rustling bush could hide an enemy fighter. Every distant sound could signal her discovery. She had basic survival training, but nothing could have prepared her for the psychological pressure of being completely isolated in hostile territory. By dawn of the 4th day, Sarah knew she had to move. Her emergency beacon had been damaged in her hasty retreat from the observation post, and her radio could only receive, not transmit. The Taliban would surely be searching for any survivors from the attack on her team. Staying in one place meant certain capture or death. She began making her way south, toward what she hoped would be friendly territory. Her training had taught her to stick to high ground and avoid populated areas, but the mountainous terrain made travel slow and exhausting. She rationed her water carefully, knowing that dehydration could kill her faster than enemy bullets. On the 5th day, Sarah's situation became desperate. She had finished the last of her food that morning, and her water was nearly gone. Worse, she had spotted Taliban patrols twice, forcing her to hide for hours at a time among the rocks and scrub brush. Her body was exhausted, her feet were blistered and bleeding, and her mind was beginning to play tricks on her. That evening, as she sheltered in a small cave, Sarah heard voices approaching. She pressed herself against the back wall of the cave and held her breath as 3 Taliban fighters passed by just outside. They were speaking in Pashto, but she caught enough words to understand they were searching for the American woman who escaped. They knew she was alive. They knew she was in the area, and they would not give up until they found her. As the voices faded into the distance, Sarah realized that her only hope was to reach higher ground where she might be able to signal for help. She had seen aircraft passing overhead twice that day, but they were too high and moving too fast for her to attract their attention. She needed to get to the ridge line, where she would have a clear view of the valley, and any aircraft might have a better chance of spotting her. The climb took her most of the night. Her legs shook with exhaustion, and several times she nearly fell from the rocky slope. But as the sun began to rise on her 6th day alone, Sarah finally reached the crest of the ridge. The view was spectacular and terrifying at the same time. She could see for miles in every direction, including several Taliban compounds in the valleys below. But she could also see something that filled her with hope. In the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, was what looked like an American forward operating base. It was at least 20 miles away, but it was there. If she could somehow signal her location, if someone was looking for her, she might actually survive this nightmare. Sarah spent that day preparing. She gathered stones to spell out SOS on a flat area near the ridge line. She practiced with her signal mirror, learning to catch and reflect the sunlight. Most importantly, she found a defensible position where she could hide if enemy forces approached while still maintaining a view of the sky. As the sun began to set on what she prayed would not be her last day of freedom, Sarah heard something that made her heart race. It was faint at first, almost lost in the wind, but gradually it grew stronger. The deep, rhythmic thrum of helicopter rotors was approaching from the south. She grabbed her signal mirror and positioned herself next to her stone SOS marker. This might be her only chance. As the sound grew louder, she began flashing the mirror toward where she thought the aircraft might appear. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short again. The international distress signal that she hoped someone would recognize. The helicopter appeared over a distant ridge, flying low and fast. Sarah's heart sank as she realized it was too far away and moving too quickly. Her mirror flashes would never be seen at that distance. But then, something incredible happened. The aircraft suddenly changed course, turning directly toward her position. Someone had seen her signal. The helicopter was still several miles away, but it was definitely heading in her direction. Sarah continued flashing her mirror while waving her arms frantically. She could now see that it was an American Black Hawk, and her relief was so overwhelming that she nearly collapsed. But her celebration was premature. From the valley below, she heard shouting in Pashto. The Taliban had spotted the helicopter too, and they were mobilizing. She could see armed men running toward vehicles, preparing to intercept whatever the Americans were planning. The race was on. The helicopter was approaching fast, but the Taliban fighters were already in their trucks and racing up the mountain road. Sarah realized with growing terror that the enemy might reach her position before the helicopter could extract her. She looked around desperately for somewhere to hide or defend herself, but the ridge line offered little cover. If the Taliban reached her first, there would be nowhere to run. After 6 days of survival against impossible odds, her rescue might arrive just moments too late.